There is a version of our past in which history does not begin with villages, kings, or empires, but with gods sitting on thrones of baked mud and starlight, ruling a very real earth for 241,200 years before the first human dynasty ever rose. Not metaphorically, not once upon a time, but as a line item in a bureaucratic document, the Sumerian list of rulers from before the flood, measured with the same cold precision as later kings. If that sounds insane, hold on. Because tonight I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm asking you to sit with it the way the ancient scribes did. Carefully, seriously, like it might be a memory instead of a myth. I want you to picture this with me, not as a distant documentary, but as something we're actually doing together. Somewhere, under the same sky you're under now, workers in 19th century Mesopotamia pry clay tablets from the wreckage of vanished cities, Shuruppak, Lhasa, Nippur. They ship them to museums where decades later, quiet men in dusty rooms lean over wedge-shaped scratches and realize they're not reading a story. They're reading a record that calmly says, before human kings, before names we can cross-check with archaeology, there was a sequence of rulers whose reign stretched not for years or centuries, but tens of thousands of years each, and the scribes do not flinch. Before we start unpacking that 241,200-year claim, let me ask you for something simple that keeps this whole journey alive. If you're the kind of person who'll sit through long-form deep dives without needing explosions every 5 seconds, hit subscribe so you stay in this circle, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I read them. It matters to know some of you are in London at 2 a.m., others in Lagos in traffic, others in small towns nobody ever films, all here for the same forbidden ledger. That's how we turn this from noise into a community. Now let's go back, not to myth, but to cuneiform. The text modern scholars call the Sumerian king list isn't one neat book. It's a tradition, carved and recopied over centuries onto tablets and prisms. One famous version, an elegant four-sided prism discovered near ancient Nippur, reads like a royal timeline. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That opening line is the grenade. It doesn't say when people invented kingship, it says it came down like a package from the sky. This is the software drop moment of civilization, stated as administrative fact. In that version, the earliest rulers belong to a time before the flood. This is not the biblical story yet. This is older. The names sound strange and far away. Alulim of Eridu, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, Dumuzid the shepherd, Ensipad Zidana, Enmendurana, Ubara Tutu. Each is assigned a reign length so absurd you'd think it was parody if it weren't written in the same deadpan tone as every other entry. Alulim, 28,800 years. Alalgar, 36,000. Some 8 kings together, 241 to 200 years. Then, the flood swept over. Only after that do we get the names that feel human. Here's what people miss. The scribes who wrote this were not teenagers writing fanfic. They were temple elites whose job was to stabilize reality with lists, offerings, rituals. When they inscribed that total of 241 to 200 years, they were not winking. For them, the antediluvian kings were part of the same continuum as the rulers they served. They copied earlier exemplars, checked traditions, edited carefully. This was state theology, yes, but theology expressed as math. They could have said, the gods reigned forever. Instead, they gave you a number, as if someone, somewhere, once counted. Skeptical scholars have good reasons to squint at this. The numbers line up too neatly with Sumerian base 60 mathematics. 60 Carson, 60, 67. You can factor them out like a code. That suggests symbolism, reigns mapped onto celestial cycles, sexagesimal elegance, numerology rather than biography. But notice what that implies. It implies they embedded cosmic timing into political memory. They chose to express the age of divine rule as a calculable span, not a vague eternity. It's as if the sky itself is their archive for what happened before human kings. Imagine being a scribe in, say, the city of Isin around 1900 BCE, tasked with producing a king list to legitimize your patron. You're not just making it up. You have older tablets, oral lines, rival city traditions. You stitch them together into one authoritative line. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak before the flood. Then Kish, Uruk, Ur, Akkad afterwards. You include the impossible prehistoric rulers, not because they're politically convenient now, but because your teachers told you they had to be there. To omit them would break the chain connecting your king to the moment kingship descended from heaven. That phrase again. It's everything. Kingship descended from heaven, not law, not reign, not blessings. Kingship, the right to rule, the authority to organize labor and declare wars, and stand between people and the gods. The list doesn't debate it. It assumes that human kingship is an inherited license from a pre-human arrangement. If we take the text at face value, the first job of those 201,200 years of God kingship was to define what rule itself is, and make sure later elites could claim continuity with it. Now here's where I want you to sit closer, because if this document were just weird, it would have been ignored. Instead, pieces of it were copied, adapted, cited, argued with for centuries. Even when the ideology shifts, the same antediluvian kings pop up in other texts as culture heroes, sages, or semi-divine figures entrusted with heavenly knowledge. Enmendorana, for example, is portrayed in later lore as a man taken up to heaven, shown the workings of the cosmos, taught divination. Sound familiar? He's an Enoch type, a bridge between gods and men. The king list is not random. It's the backbone for a mythic legal universe. We also need to notice something deliciously awkward. The list does distinguish between believable and unbelievable, just not where you'd expect. After the flood, reign lengths shrink from tens of thousands to hundreds, then to more plausible numbers as we move into periods where we have independent inscriptions, city archives, monumental ruins. The same tradition that assigns Alulim 28 to 800 years also gives us a Mebaraj Sai of Kish, a name confirmed by archaeology. It balances on that edge, real enough to test, wild enough to unsettle. So what do we do with 8 kings ruling for 241,200 years? You can write it off as mythologized chronology, where enormous numbers express reverence. You can treat it as an encoded star calendar chiseled into royal lore. Or you can entertain without swallowing the possibility that this is a corrupted memory of a time when those who held power over early humanity did so for spans and with capacities that later generations could only call divine. Not because they glowed, but because they endured and knew things no one else did. Let's lean for a moment into how that would feel on the ground. Imagine you're a late Stone Age community in southern Mesopotamia. The climate's unstable, floods and droughts bite. Then a group arrives, or emerges, with structured agriculture, irrigation plans, timekeeping, maybe a terrifying mastery of metallurgy and drugs and predictive astronomy. They don't just survive, they optimize. To you, living in that, their leadership doesn't cycle every generation. Their project persists for so long it blurs into always. When your descendants finally learn to write, how else would they describe the origin of kingship except as something that arrived from above and lasted longer than human memory? And this is where the king list's chill precision becomes a problem for the comfortable view. If all of this were just soft focus legend, we'd expect inconsistent rambles. Instead, we see a tight formula. Kingship descends, resides in a city, is exercised by a specific named ruler for a quantified span, then moves. Even the flood is treated as a line break in a ledger, not a fairy tale. Then the flood swept over, After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Dry, official, like they're moving a capital post-disaster, not rebooting creation. For me, what makes this text so gripping, and why I'm bringing it to you like this, is not that it proves gods with space helmets ruled for 1,200 years. It's that the people closest to the cradle of written history went out of their way to anchor their own fragile local regimes into a story that begins with superhuman timeframes and heavenly authorization. They are desperate to be continuations, not experiments. And tucked inside that desperation is either a memory of a real, overwhelming predecessor or a blueprint of how power sells itself as cosmic destiny. We haven't yet touched the really strange resonance that when you line up that 240,200-year block with certain astronomical and geological cycles, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, the pacing of ice ages, you find suggestive overlaps. I'm not going to hand you numerology as fact, but think how Sumerian scholar priests thought in base 60 in star cycles, in ritual loops. If they encoded a cosmic rhythm into the ages of their god-kings, it suggests those reigns may double as markers for something much bigger that they believed ruled Earth long before men with brick palaces did. This is only the beginning. Right now, I want you to hold the image of that clay prism in your mind. 4 narrow sides, lines of ancient wedges, starting its account of rulership not with "once there were villages," but with the calm assertion that for 241,200 years, beings they call kings, and we would call gods, governed here. That's the frame your ancestors in this land used for history itself. Everything else is footnote. And sitting here with you, across time zones and languages, what I'm trying to do is simple. I'm not handing you a dogma. I'm putting that prism on the table between us and asking, why were they so sure? Why did sober temple bureaucrats carve the age of gods as numbers you can add, instead of mist you can ignore? Why did they treat the descent of kingship from heaven as the central unbroken thread of our story? If you can feel that tension, the pull between this is myth and this is someone's record, then you're exactly where I want you for what comes next. Because to really understand how dangerous, beautiful and manipulative that 241,200-year claim is, we have to follow it outward, into the cities those god-kings are tied to, the flood that wipes them away, the human dynasties that claim their mantle, and the modern systems that still echo their logic without ever writing their names. Imagine standing in Eridu before Eridu had ruins, before words like Sumer or civilization, or even history existed if we take the king list at face value. A low rise above the marshes, reed houses clinging to the edges of a waterlogged world, the horizon broken only by the shimmer of lagoons and the silhouettes of date palms. Then there is one structure that isn't like the others, built on a raised platform, aligned with something the villagers can't name, occupied by a figure they don't choose. This place becomes the anchor. Later generations will call it the House of Enki, Lord of subterranean waters and wisdom. But if you read the line, after kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Literally, this is the landing site. A throne installed, not negotiated. The first name the list gives us is Alulim of Eridu, with his 28-hour 800-year reign. No biography, no miracles, just a name and a span. That starkness is unsettling. It feels like looking at an entry from a hard drive without the user manual. If we strip away the fantasy for a moment and imagine what kind of thing could be remembered like that, one possibility is a lineage fused into one mask, a continuous ruling project, coded as a single ruler. The face changes, the underlying directive doesn't, so later scribes compress it. Alulim, the first. Almost 30 millennia, summarized as one uninterrupted sovereignty at the swamp's edge, where fresh water, trade routes, and access to the Gulf converge. Look at Eridu archaeologically, and something is off in a way that fits the story better than it should. The mound we call Tel Abu Shahrain holds layer upon layer of temples built on the same spot, redesigned, raised, rebuilt, like someone hitting update on the same sacred app over and over. From as early as we can see, it's already a cult center. You'd expect a messy evolution. Instead, you get a stubborn fixation on that one node. The king list agrees this is where kingship first lodges. And in the mythology, Enki, the god of wisdom, crafts, and subterranean waters, lives here, tinkering, designing humans, storing the me, the decrees and technologies that make civilization possible. The second ruler is Al-Algar, also of Eridu, with 36,000 years. No epic, no statue, just the extension of a pattern, divine administration locked to one site. Think of that like a story of a lab that does not close, outlasting floods and family lines, remembered as one long reign, because the people inside it never surrender their role as intermediaries. By the time the tradition is written, that continuity feels inhuman. So they call them gods. The durations reflect not a single organism's lifespan, but the perceived age of a system that predates everyone talking about it. Then kingship is taken to Bad Tibira, a transfer, not an invention. That verb matters. Eridu doesn't fall into mythic mush. It is replaced as primary node, and another city takes over the office of ruling under heaven. Bad Tibira's antediluvian kings like Enmen-Lu-Ana and Enmen-Gal-Ana stack up dozens of millennia between them. Bad Tibira itself, in tradition, is a center of metallurgy and animal wealth, the fortress of the metalworkers. If you're hearing industrial hub in that and feeling uneasy, you're not alone. The story is that the second phase of god kingship plugs into production, metal, herds, the means to feed and arm a controlled population. We move to Larak, to Sippar, to Shurupak, each city held up as host of kingship, each antediluvian ruler tagged with another incomprehensible reign. Larak, almost lost to us, appears as a ghost in the list, associated with a shepherd king. Sippar, later famed for the sun god's cult and scribal centers, is given Enmen-Dur-Ana, the one whisked up to heaven to be taught the secrets of the gods. Shurupak, whose last king Ubara-Tutu anchors the ledger right before the flood, is also the home of Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood hero. The geography isn't random. The network of pre-flood kingship runs along river, trade, and knowledge corridors, the exact points you'd pick if you were strategically managing an early world. Inside this structure, the flood is not a bedtime story. It is a controlled reset. Then the flood swept over. The language is clinical. In Mesopotamian myth, the gods decide humans are too noisy, too numerous. One sympathetic deity leaks the secret to a chosen king, who builds a vessel, rides out the annihilation, receives life and rule afterwards. If we line that beside the king list, the flood sits like a hard restart between two operating systems, the 241,200-year epoch of divine administration and the shorter, messier era of post-flood human kings. This is where it gets politically sharp. After the deluge, the text says, when kingship had descended from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. Notice that. It doesn't say humans took charge. It says the same heavenly license is granted anew, now to mortal dynasties. Kish becomes the first city where humans wear crowns in the name of a precedent set by gods. The list instantly legitimizes those rulers by docking them into a cosmic continuity. They are not local thugs. They are recipients of the second descent of kingship. The invisible contract survives the catastrophe. From a control perspective, this is genius. You frame your current king as the heir of an impossibly ancient office forged before the flood. Any revolt against him can be cast as revolt against the ordering principle of the universe. You also bake obedience into cosmology. Rule is not emergent from below, it's a package from above. And remember, I'm not inventing this framing. It's in their own words. Kingship descended. Twice. It is always something bestowed, never negotiated. The 1,200-year prelude becomes not just a weird curiosity, but the foundation of a theology of power. But what if behind the theology there's also data? Those giant reigns, as modern scholars have noticed, reduce into neat sexagesimal patterns. They might encode celestial periods, cycles of precession, lunar-solar harmonics, or other long astronomical beats. From that angle, the antediluvian kings are not men, or even individual gods, but names hung on segments of a cosmic timetable. Alulim is this many years because that block corresponds to such and such sky cycle. The total 241,200 years becomes a master interval. That reading doesn't debunk the list, it deepens it. It becomes a tool for tracking epochs, wrapped in the skin of royal history. Now connect that to how ancient elites behaved. You don't want the masses doing full-spectrum astronomy. You want them respecting rituals whose hidden rhythm your class understands. You embed your chronometric knowledge in sacred numbers, in king lists, in myths of world ages. Only the initiated see that Alulim, 28,800 years, is also X precessional units, or Y repeats of a grand cycle. Suddenly, the list is doing double duty, glorifying divine rule and quietly carrying technical knowledge through generations of conquest, language shifts, and illiteracy. If we allow ourselves, just for a thought experiment, to read the God-King era as both a memory and a code, a picture emerges of a long-lived custodial class, maybe literally non-human in the eyes of their subjects, maybe just radically more advanced, who track geological and astronomical threats and restructure society after each calamity. When their time ends, consciously or in catastrophe, their successors keep their calendar but lose their context. You get humans in crowns, clinging to borrowed legitimacy, enforcing rituals whose meaning only half survives. I want you to notice, too, how the Sumerian king list is obsessed with where kingship is hosted, not just who holds it. Cities rise and fall as official centers: Eridu, Bad-Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak, Kish, Uruk, Akkad, and so on. Each transfer is framed like a ceremonial relocation of a franchise, not a revolution. In a modern sense, it's like saying, headquarters has moved. Policy remains the same. That's exactly how a template from an earlier epoch would propagate, not through individuals, but through institutional seats that claim stewardship over the same descending authority. At the same time, hairline fractures show. Some versions of the list disagree on details. Local traditions try to insert their own founders, their own city as rightful early host. That conflict tells us something crucial. There were competing memories and power claims about the deep past, and the version we have is the one that won. The fact that elites were fighting to retrofit themselves into the antediluvian framework suggests that framework held enormous persuasive power. You didn't want to be new. You wanted to be old, even if you had to rewrite the tablets to get there. And here's where I turn back to you, because this isn't just about dusty tablets. This is about how we, even now, let age and origin hypnotize us. This is how it has always been, remains one of the most effective spells in politics, religion, economics. The Sumerian king list is an early, raw version of that spell. Look, our authority traces back 241 to 200 years, to when gods themselves ruled. Are you really going to question it? Once you see that move in its first carved form, you start recognizing its descendants everywhere. I'm not asking you to commit to a literal reading where shining titans sat on chairs for aeons. I'm asking you to respect how carefully this story was shaped, how firmly it was believed, and how effectively it bound human rulers to a mythic license issued from heaven. Whether that license began as the charter of advanced visitors, Ice Age survivors, or poetic stargazers, its survival into our institutions is the real phenomenon. The list survives because its structure works. We also need to be honest about the other possibility, that the antediluvian section isn't just propaganda upward, but testimony downward. A compressed, corrupted recollection of a time when whatever governed human communities, and perhaps played with our biology, our environment, our myths, operated on scales that make our centuries feel like seconds. If that's true, then the unease you feel reading those numbers is appropriate. The god kings of the list would not just be nicer versions of us. They'd be something categorically different, and our historical kings, their clumsy imitators. So we're left with this double-edged artifact, a political tool that might be built on a genuine, half-remembered fracture in human experience. The 241 to 200 years are either the grandest con ever carved into clay, or the outline of a custodial epoch we barely understand, or both at once, truth used in service of control. And the only reason we're able to have this conversation now is because those scribes were too reverent or too frightened to erase the divine section when new regimes rose. They preserved the part that made their own kings small. Sitting here speaking to you, with that prism and those fragments in mind, my goal isn't to drag you into automatic belief or lazy debunking, but to sharpen your vision, to show you how far back the game of our power comes from the gods, from before the flood, from beyond question, really goes, and to invite you to hold that claim up to the light instead of swallowing it, because it's ancient. The fact that we can read their list now means the spell is already cracked. If you're still with me after this, across your own late hour and whatever else you could be doing, then you're exactly the kind of mind I trust to go further. Because next, I want to walk you through how that flood line functions as a deliberate firewall between epochs, how the post-flood kings scramble to wrap themselves in antediluvian glory, and how echoes of that structure leak into biblical, Greek, and later traditions that still shape what billions of people think history is. If you want me to continue this story with you, say continue. The line that slices the clay is deceptively simple. Then the flood swept over. No thunder, no drama, just a full stop between worlds. On one side, the god kings with reigns that stretch into the geological. On the other, the stuttering rise of human dynasties. That one sentence behaves like a firewall in code. Whatever happened before is sealed behind mythic compression. Whatever comes after is under new credentials, but still hooked into kingship from heaven. When you watch how carefully that line is positioned, you start to feel that this isn't just a story of punishment. It's a protocol. Wipe the slate, preserve the license, reboot the system through a chosen survivor. In the Sumerian version, that survivor is Ziusudra of Shurupak. He's not a random righteous guy. He is the last antediluvian king, the final name on the divine side of the ledger. It's his city that hosts kingship when the flood is triggered. One god, Enki, the same watery intelligence associated with Eridu and hidden knowledge, whispers the warning through a wall. Ziusudra builds a boat, rides out a disaster that kills all seed of life, emerges, makes an offering, and is granted an extraordinary gift, life like a god in a distant place. Now look at how that slots into the list. The king at the end of the 241, 200-year sequence doesn't just survive. He is exported. The era of gods ruling on earth ends. One of their own, fused with a human throne, is taken off the board. In later Akkadian retellings, you meet him as Utnapishtim. In the Hebrew tradition, his story mutates into Noah. In each, the pattern remains. A chosen man receives secret intel from a sympathetic deity, builds a vessel, preserves life, watches everyone else erased. What rarely gets talked about is the political shadow of that story. When your culture believes its current order descends from the one man who had the password before the world reset, Questioning that order becomes more than dissent. It becomes ingratitude toward the only reason you exist. The flood myth doesn't only scare you with water, it scares you with lineage. Now flip back to the king list, post-flood. It doesn't say, and humanity freely organized itself anew. It says, after the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Again with the descent. Again with the idea that authority is something conferred from above, not emergent from below. Kish, a very human city, becomes the first to wear that reinstated crown. Its early rulers are still given suspiciously long reigns by our standards, hundreds of years, but the numbers are contracting. It feels like the tapering of a signal from divine to mortal bandwidth. Kish's kings are not gods, but they are wrapped in the residue of gods. One of them, Etana, is called the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all foreign countries. His legend tells of an eagle, a flight to the sky, a quest for a plant of birth. Sound familiar? Thematically, he's a remix of those pre-flood mediators, someone who negotiates between earth and heaven, legitimizing rule through vertical contact. The king list calmly logs him as just another ruler. That blending of mythic ascent with administrative sequence is the exact seam where narrative and policy clasp hands. The next great node is Uruk, with names that echo through epics. You get Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and eventually Gilgamesh, rulers who live partly in stone, partly in story. The king list treats them as kings in a chain that began before the flood. The epics portray them wrestling with gods, monsters, immortality itself. What ties them back to the antediluvian block is not time, but function. They are, in literary form, exactly what the post-flood kings of the list claim to be politically. Humans trying to inhabit a role designed for beings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. If you put yourself in the sandals of a subject in that world, this setup is brutal and brilliant. You're born into a city whose king tells you his authority is descended from a line that began when kingship fell out of the sky. The priests back him up with tablets that run all the way to names no one has seen for ages. The myths tell you the last time humanity's behavior displeased these higher powers, a flood hit all lands, and only one compliant insider survived. The clear message, stay inside the pattern, those who step out drown. It is existential gatekeeping. There's another layer, quieter, that modern readers often miss. The king list is obsessed with continuity through catastrophe. Even the flood doesn't annul the concept of kingship. It interrupts, then renews. It's like saying, no matter what happens, cosmic war, climate collapse, divine tantrum, the office remains. That idea seeps outward. You feel it later in doctrines of divine right, in claims that thrones are sacred even when occupants are monsters, in narratives where empires fall but the mandate endures. These are distant echoes of a clay assertion. Gods ruled first, therefore rule itself is sacred. Watch how this ghost steps into other literatures. In the Bible, the genealogies before the flood give patriarchs absurdly long lifespans that contract after the deluge, mirroring the king list's drastic shrink from antediluvian to post-diluvian reigns. In Greek traditions, you get ages of Kronos and Zeus before the time of human kings. Later philosophers and church fathers argue over whether these extreme numbers are literal, symbolic, or corrupted memories. They are replaying, in slow motion, the same discomfort you and I are sitting with now. What do we do with texts that insist someone was in charge long before us, for longer than is comfortable? Now, if this all were pure propaganda, you'd expect nothing but smooth agreement. Instead, we see fractures. Different copies of the king list tweak names and totals to privilege their city. Some omit certain rulers. Some add local heroes. This tells us that deep time authority was a contested resource. Every regime wanted to plug itself into the antediluvian backbone. Nobody dared throw the backbone away. That tension between creative editing and fearful preservation is exactly what makes the list such a revealing artifact. Here's the part I need you to feel, not just understand. When you read 241 years, your modern brain tosses it into myth and moves on. But the average person in Old Babylonian Isin hearing this recited would feel something else: smallness, awe, and reassurance. Smallness because their whole life fits into a speck after an unimaginable prelude. Awe because they live under a system old enough to survive floods. Reassurance because their current king, however flawed, supposedly sits on a throne that has never truly been vacant. That's a powerful anesthetic against revolt and against curiosity, and yet inside the stories built on this spine, doubts leak through. Gilgamesh rages against death, discovers even God-blessed immortality is a one-off exception. Enki breaks ranks to save Ziusudra. The gods in the flood myth panic at their own storm, cower like flies over the sacrifice. Their rule, even in myth, is not flawless. If the list is a corporate press release, the epics are the whistleblower memos. Together, they paint a picture not of serene, perfect gods, but of long-lived, powerful, fallible intelligences whose authority depends on managing information about beginnings and ends. When modern readers, especially in the fringe and alternative history worlds, grab the Sumerian king list, they often swing hard to one side. Aliens ruled us for 241,200 years. Case closed. Mainstream skeptics swing just as hard the other way. Oh, it's number play and royal PR. Nothing to see. My position with you here is that both moves are too easy. The interesting territory is in the middle, where we treat the text as a serious data point about how the earliest literate societies remembered deep time, encoded cosmology, and manufactured legitimacy. Whether those antediluvian kings were symbolic ages, deified ancestor clans, survivors of a previous civilization, off-world administrators, or narrative masks for star cycles, one fact holds: later human rulers claimed their crown as a continuation of that line. They built a world in which authority is always pointing backward and upward, never outward and inward. You're supposed to feel grateful the throne still exists, not ask who benefits from the story that it must. Now see how that logic outlives its original clay. Empires fall, religions mutate, languages die, but we still find leaders wrapping themselves in founding fathers, ancient mandates, divine will, unchanging tradition. We still find institutions defended on the grounds that they are old, that they descend from sacred beginnings. That pattern is not accidental. It is the same skeleton the king list carved: timeline as weapon, origin as shield, myth as chain of custody. This is why the Sumerian king list, dusty and technical as it looks, sits at the root of your favorite conspiracies and your quietest suspicions. It is one of the earliest surviving statements that says, in effect, we've been in charge since before the world as you know it. You're late to the story. Sit down. To engage with it properly is not to genuflect or to scoff. It is to calmly flip that script and remember that our capacity to read it now, to compare versions, to challenge its implications, means the spell is no longer total. If we keep following this line, we can track exactly how the post-flood kings leveraged that antediluvian legacy, how the shift from impossibly long reigns to human spans doesn't diminish the sacredness of kingship, but intensifies its insecurity, and how that insecurity drives priesthoods, empires, and later secret societies to clutch ever tighter at the story that the gods ruled first. That is where this gets close to modern power in a way most people are not prepared for. But you are, or you wouldn't still be here. So here's my question to you, as someone clearly willing to sit in the deep end with me. Do you want me to keep going? to dig into how that inherited myth of divine kingship bleeds into later religious chronologies, occult lineages, and modern narratives that still pretend to speak with the voice of a 200-year throne. If yes, tell me to continue, and we'll keep unraveling it together. There's a trick all enduring empires learn, and it starts right where we left off, on that clay line between the world before and the world after the flood. If you can convince people that your authority is the legal heir of a power that ruled for 241,200 years before the catastrophe, then every palace wall and tax receipt becomes holy by association. The brilliance of the Sumerian king list is that it doesn't just remember the antediluvian kings, it weaponizes them. And to see how far that weapon reaches, we have to follow the story into the hands of the kings and scribes who came next, who saw that strange ledger and thought, this is how we anchor ourselves to heaven. Picture an early king of Kish sitting in a hall lit by oil lamps, while a scribe recites his lineage, not just son of so-and-so, not just victor in battle, but successor to a line that began when kingship descended from the sky to Eridu, flowed through Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, survived a world-washing flood, and chose specifically now to sit in Kish. That performance isn't background noise. It's a spell. The man on the throne is being wrapped in the mantle of a cosmic institution that predates the memory of mountains. Anyone in that room thinking of rebellion now has to push against 241,200 years of precedent. From Kish, the mantle moves to Uruk, to Ur, to Akkad. Each transfer in the king list is written as if the office itself is a traveling god. Kingship was taken too. The language is bureaucratic and mystical at once. It tells you that cities rise and fall, but kingship as a sacred force never retires. When Sargon of Akkad bursts onto the scene as the upstart who had no father and seized power, later scribes fold him directly into this chain. The illegitimate baby in the basket becomes, on clay, a vessel chosen by the same descending kingship that once sat in the laps of antediluvian rulers. His conquest become not ambition, but destiny executing an ancient contract. Watch how legal texts lean on this logic. When a king inscribes laws, he doesn't present himself as a clever politician. He says a great God called him, showed him justice, handed him a rod and ring of authority. The Sumerian and Akkadian tradition is saturated with images of deities entrusting decrees, arts, and dominion to rulers. The king list provides the spine for that imagery, a remembered age when beings closer to those gods actually ruled, establishing the prototype that modern kings theatrically reenact. In that reenactment, law is not negotiated, it's revealed. The seduction of this model is so strong that even when cultures break away from Mesopotamian religion, they quietly adopt the structure. Look at how later Hebrew writers handle time. They create genealogies before and after a flood. They assign absurd lifespans to antediluvian patriarchs, then sharply reduce them post-diluvium, just like the king list contracts kingly reigns. They reposition the source of kingship from Enlil and Anu to Yahweh. But the architecture remains. There is a beginning when humans live almost godlike long, then a catastrophe, then a controlled new era in which authority depends on loyalty to the one source who saved a chosen man. When the text says the Lord was grieved and brings a flood, saves Noah, and then legislates anew, you're seeing a theological counterclaim to the Mesopotamian narrative that Enki leaked the plan to Ziusudra and the gods bickered over it. Competing brands, same substrate. Your survival, your right to rule, your moral code are framed as downstream of a pre-human decision. Question that, and you are not just wrong. You are ungrateful for existence. Swing west and you hear another remix. Greek traditions talk of ages of Kronos and Zeus, of a time when gods directly ruled or walked among humans before a succession of upheavals. Egypt, as we've already walked, lays out divine and semi-divine dynasties stretching back into an opaque first time. In Mesoamerica, codices mark world ages and floods that reset cosmic contracts. They're not copying each other's names. They're inhabiting the same instinct. Out there in the deep past is a throne, and our thrones now either honor or defy it. What the Sumerian king list gives us, uniquely, is a measurable claim. Not once gods ruled, but they ruled for 200 years, 8 names, then the flood. When that structure seeps into neighboring cultures, the numbers change, the names mutate, but the move survives. Massive lifespans or reigns to mark the god age, then a crash, then smaller, shakier, human-scale rule that can't quite let go of the idea that legitimacy must point backward. That habit of mind, more than any single tablet, is what still haunts us. Here's where I want to talk to you personally for a second. You're here, still listening, because some part of you recognizes this pattern playing out in our own time. Modern institutions rarely say Enlil chose us, but they find their own first times. Founding charters, revolutionary moments, technological dawns, the post-war order, the Enlightenment values, whatever phrase sits on their ceremonial stone. Those moments are framed as sacrosanct, above debate, the point from which all right order flows. If you challenge how things are built now, defenders reach not for today's real conditions, but for that founding myth. We have always done it this way. This is who we are. Once you've stared long enough at a clay prism calmly stating that 8 god-kings ruled Earth for 241,200 years, and therefore your city's current boss is legitimate, it becomes a lot easier to see how, because we descend from X, is not an argument, it's a technique. It might be grounded in something real. It might be air. The point is, continuity sells. Antiquity sells. Saying, my authority comes from a source outside human reach, sells, whether that source is Shamash, the Constitution, the invisible hand of the market, or an algorithm. Yet buried like static in all these clean narratives are stories of rupture and betrayal. Gods who regret their decisions, kings who fall, cities cursed and razed, prophets who insist the current priests have hijacked the mandate, mystics who claim you don't need a king or institution to touch the divine. Every time that voice appears, it's an attack on the core thesis of the king list. That kingship is a sealed vertical download. You either accept or drown. Now, I'm not trying to rip meaning out of your world and hand you nothing. I'm trying to show you the wiring, so you're not hypnotized by the theater. The possibility that there really were long cycles, previous high cultures, non-human intelligences, cataclysms, worth exploring. The fact that ancient scribes took those possibilities seriously enough to calcify them into royal theology? Crucial. But between you and those claims, standing on the stage, are thousands of years of people in crowns saying, this all proves I get to tell you what to do. This is why the Sumerian king list is so much more than a curiosity for tablet nerds or a proof text for alien YouTube. It's the root blueprint of how power narrates itself. Start with the gods, stretch their reign so far no one can imagine beyond it. Insert a surgical apocalypse, restart with yourself as beneficiary. Once you've seen that formula, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, the old spell, because it has always been so, starts to crack. There's still one more layer I want to take you into. How, after Mesopotamia's empires crumble, pieces of this king list logic leak into channeled traditions, esoteric schools, apocalyptic cults, and eventually modern conspiracy myths that insist hidden bloodlines and secret orders are the last custodians of an unbroken pre-flood mandate. Some of those groups absolutely believe they're heir to Ziusudra, to Alulim, to the watchers of 241,200 years. Whether they're right or deluded, their belief shapes events. That's where this topic goes, from interesting ancient text to live operating code in politics, religion, and fringe culture right now. And if you're still here with me, you're exactly the kind of person I trust to walk into that minefield without losing your balance. It starts to spread like a template more than a tale. Once scribes crystallize the pattern, vast antediluvian rule, a cleansing calamity, a second descent of kingship, later elites learn to drape themselves in it. The clay ledger becomes a portable altar. Set it down in a new city, say the right names, stitch yourself to the pre-flood backbone, and suddenly your crown gleams with a light you didn't earn. That's the quiet industry I want you to see. Not only the making of myths, but the manufacturing of mandates that pretend to be older than time. Even empires that replaced the Mesopotamian gods kept the scaffolding. Under Persian rule, priests begin speaking in world cycles, great ages measured in the slow breathing of the sky, each with its own rulers and resets. If you listen closely, you hear the familiar rhythm. Golden beginnings, a fall into noise, a cleansing, a renewed office. The language changes, the logic doesn't. Kingship is never a local habit. It is a license that keeps renewing, always from above. Whoever holds the license claims to be aligned with the clock that turns the firmament itself. The Hellenistic world inherits the dossier and repackages it for new audiences. A Babylonian priest writing in Greek compiles a line of antediluvian kings so long the mind balks, another ledger that treats divine rule as arithmetic, not dream. Maybe he exaggerates to impress skeptical readers. Maybe he's preserving a rival tradition where the count runs even further back. Either way, the move is the same. The deeper the number, the taller the throne you can build on it. A bigger past becomes a larger warrant for the present. Wherever priestly elites guard memory, they also guard the origin. In Second Temple texts, patriarchs before the deluge live for spans that echo those clay rains. After the waters recede, lifespans contract like a cooling spring. Enoch is taken up, instructed in the secrets of the heavens, sent back with calendars and warnings. The watchers descend, meddle, and are punished. The stage is dressed differently, but the wiring remains. There was a time when knowledge and rule flowed vertically. There was a cut, and there are still channels through which a chosen few receive the signal and pass it on. Medieval rulers refine the gearwork into ceremony. A king is not crowned because he commands armies. He is crowned because oil touches his brow in a rite that points backward to a founding gift. Charters are forged to claim an unbroken chain from empire to church to crown. The theatre says, sovereignty isn't mere force, it is custody of an ancient deposit. The public sees silk and gold, the initiated see continuity, the post-flood license printed on new letterhead. Even when the document is fake, the craving for pre-human endorsement is real. Other civilizations hum a different melody over the same bass note. In Iran, the divine glory, far, shines on those chosen to rule, a celestial radiance that can depart. If the holder betrays cosmic order, in China, the mandate legitimizes a dynasty while also threatening it. Heaven grants and withdraws approval as omens and seasons change. It's a more accountable version, but it still keeps origin off the human table. Heaven decides. You inherit legitimacy by aligning with a pattern that predates you, not by consent from the ground. Esoteric schools keep the lineage story alive when public cults fade. Masonry wraps its ethic in the myth of an architect slain for guarding sacred measures. Rosicrucian manifestos claim a brotherhood preserving prisms of Prisca Theologia, an original wisdom older than any church. Whether their histories are real or invented, the pitch is constant. We carry forward a pre-flood light through the wreckage of ages, join, endure the trials, receive fragments of the ancient me. the decrees and crafts that make a civilization more than mud and muscle. Renaissance humanists add a gloss of philosophy. Translating Hermetic texts, they dream of a pure theology predating all sects, a first revelation from which later religions dimly descend. That hunger bends policy. Princes fund temples to time, gardens where obelisks and sundials declare that wise rule is rule in phase with the heavens. The frescoes change saints for sages, the geometry stays. We are not inventing a way to live, they insist. We are remembering it, and that remembrance justifies authority. Modern chronologists wage a quiet war over the length of the past, because whoever frames the clock frames legitimacy. Compress time, and origin becomes recent, fragile, negotiable. Stretch it, and your institutions sit on bedrock. Each scheme offers a different comfort, a young earth with clear moral lines, or an ancient world with venerable roots. Underneath the spreadsheets, the old contest continues. Who owns the beginning, and what does that ownership buy in the present? Then the fringe returns, loud and unruly, pulling the clay ledger into neon light. Ancient visitors, engineered humans, planetary overseers. The details differ. The impulse matches the oldest tablets. Power is not born here. It arrives. Some are sincere attempts to explain anomalies. Some are adventure stories sold as research. Either way, the psychological effect duplicates the king list's function. It puts a superhuman figure at the top of the file and invites you to slot today's elites beneath it as heirs, clients, or rebels against that prime authority. Meanwhile, secret bloodline narratives creep through late-night forums and whispered books. 13 families, Merovingian veins, hidden heirs of temple gold. Almost none of it can be proved. All of it feeds off the ancient hunger to locate a living thread back to the pre-flood office. It's a modern folk magic of legitimacy. If your preferred tribe can claim a drop from Alulim's cup by genealogy, symbol, or synchronicity, you can feel chosen in a world that otherwise treats you like a number in a queue. There's a new priesthood now, smiling from behind glass and code. They don't chant in Sumerian. They publish white papers. Their temples are data centers. Their sacraments are updates. Yet listen to the claims. The system knows, the model decides. The algorithm is impartial and therefore above appeal. That is just a secular recoding of kingship descends. The authority lives outside the citizen's reach, comes from an altar of math and machine, and legitimizes decisions by pointing to an origin you cannot interrogate. But the ancient dossier also smuggles in an antidote, and it's easy to miss because it is written in small strokes, scribes copying rather than erasing. Even when regimes changed, even when cities burned, someone decided not to delete the antediluvian section. They could have started with Kish and avoided the whole embarrassment. They didn't. They carried the scandal forward. The gods ruled first. By preserving what could have undermined them, they left us a tool to measure how power narrates itself across resets. So the question is not whether to accept or reject the old ledger wholesale. It's whether to recognize how origin stories can be turned into weapons and then to blunt them by making the knowledge common. Astronomy stops being a priest's monopoly. It becomes everyone's sky. Sacred geometry stops being a vault secret. It becomes public design. Calendars stop being locks, they become schedules. That is how you de-enchant the throne without flattening the world into cynicism. I keep returning to the image of a museum case lit by a single strip of LED. A prism of baked clay stands there, incised by hands that never imagined your eyes. The wedges are small, fussy, relentless. You can almost hear the decisions. To include this city and not that one. To keep the God King's arithmetic. To mark the flood, not with poetry, but with a line of prose. The artifact is political, yes, but it is also a love letter to continuity. A human refusal to let memory drown entirely. Walking out of that room into your city's anonymous light, you start spotting the pattern on billboards, in oaths, in mission statements. Since 1789, from time immemorial, founded on eternal principles. The dates change like costumes. The trick is the same, borrowing thunder from a beginning. I'm not telling you to sneer every time you see it. I'm telling you to ask who wrote that beginning, who benefits from it now, and whether the knowledge attached to it is being shared or hoarded. There's a narrow path between two cliffs, gullibility and denial, and that's where I want us walking. On one side, the urge to kneel to any story with a long enough pedigree. On the other, the urge to laugh off every deep time claim as propaganda. The clay ledger warns against both. It shows how sophisticated ancient minds were at binding memory to power, and it hints, just enough, that something real, cyclical, possibly catastrophic, sits under the stories, a reality that demanded calendars and kings and watchmen on ziggurats. If there were custodians before us, they were not omnipotent. Even their own myths show panic, disagreement, unintended consequences. That should comfort you. The office may be ancient, its occupants were fallible, which means we are allowed to interrogate the inheritance, to keep what is true, respect for cycles, humility before the river, care for the archive, and to discard what was only ever theatre, untouchable thrones, secrecy as virtue, punishment as proof of legitimacy. And if there were not literal god-kings, if the antediluvian block is a calendar in costume, the lesson holds. We are the ones deciding what to do with the measures and myths we inherited. We can keep using them to centralize power behind curtains, or we can turn them outward as shared tools for a species that has to navigate floods of its own making now. The story is old. The choice is always new. I know this is heavy, and I know you could be anywhere else. But if you've made it this far with me, then you're part of the small, stubborn crowd that doesn't need jump cuts to stay awake. That means you're exactly who I'm making this for. People who want to understand how a number like 201,200 can still bend a spine in the present, and how to stand up straight anyway. So I'll leave you for now with a litmus test you can carry into any temple or timeline. Whenever someone claims authority by pointing at a beginning you cannot touch, ask for the knowledge that comes with it. If they give it freely, you might be near a real tradition. If they clutch and scold, you're back in the shadow of the clay prism, listening to borrowed thunder. You get to decide whether to step out from under it. When regimes rise on borrowed thunder, they eventually feel the urge to weaponize not only the beginning but the end. If your mandate is tied to a story that starts before the flood, why not tether it to a script that ends with you still in charge? That instinct threads straight out of Mesopotamian thinking into later apocalyptic chronologies. In some Zoroastrian systems, for instance, history is laid out as a fixed-length drama, world ages measured, cosmic conflict scheduled, restoration guaranteed. The pattern, again, is that time is not open. It's a tracked asset. Somewhere written or unwritten, there is a ledger like the king list that not only catalogues who ruled, but when the curtain finally drops, and under whose authority. As these ideas seep into the Levant and beyond, the architecture twists but doesn't vanish. In the Hebrew scriptures, life spans before the flood balloon into centuries, then collapse afterwards, mirroring that Sumerian contraction from impossible reigns to mortal spans. Genesis genealogies quietly function like a domestic king list, a chain from creation to cataclysm to covenant. Later, apocalyptic texts start measuring from those anchors, counting weeks of years, jubilees, symbolic days. The premise remains familiar. Someone, somewhere, knows the timetable because the author disclosed it. Modern readers argue whether the numbers are literal or figurative, but structurally it's the same play. Authority flows from custody of a special calendar said to originate before ordinary history began. As Christianity grows inside this world of measured endings, you see a fight over who is allowed to read the clock. Early communities debate dates, ages, the meaning of 1,000 years or time, times, and half a time. Bishops and scholars assemble chronologies from Adam to their present, picking which ancient lists to trust, which to discard. When Bishop Ussher, many centuries later, famously dates creation to 4004 BCE, he's not doing something new. He's sprinting with the same torch, trying to compress everything into a neatly managed span that makes history legible and controllable. Opposite him, geology and archaeology begin whispering of deep time, of ages that make even 241,200 years look modest. Now the struggle over the beginning is also a struggle over who owns reality. Under empires and churches, apocalyptic expectation becomes both a pressure valve and a leash. You tell people that their rulers are placed by God as part of a story that began before the flood and will climax in fire or judgment on a specified script. On the surface, this can comfort the powerless. Injustice is temporary. Arrogant kings will be cut down. But if interpreted through the lens of the king list mentality, it does something darker. It reassures rulers that their throne too participates in a cosmic necessity. Even when they're warned they might be beasts, not blessed, they can still pose as actors named in the secret schedule. Anyone questioning them can be framed as resisting prophecy itself. Around the edges of official religion, alternative custodians of the real timeline start to appear like mushrooms. Some are small ascetic circles counting down to dates. Others are literate cliques copying forbidden books. They all share one trait, the claim that mainstream priests lost or corrupted the original contract. This is a riff on the Sumerian anxiety about which city truly hosted the first kingship. Now the competition is over who has the unedited map from antediluvian wisdom through the flood into now. The public rarely sees clay or codes. They see charismatic figures gesturing at an invisible archive. By the time we hit the crusading centuries, myths of ancient mandates have soaked into political blood. A military monastic order like the Knights Templar doesn't need an explicit line back to Alulim. It gains power by hinting at hidden charters, secret finds under Temple Mount, knowledge too explosive for ordinary souls. When the French crown burns them, legends thicken, treasure smuggled away, books encoded, lines continued elsewhere. Regardless of what's true, we're in the same gravitational field, the conviction that there are parallel custodianships of origin, one public, one veiled. Those legends reappear centuries later as raw material for new groups. Rosicrucian manifestos speak of an invisible fraternity of sages tending a primordial wisdom through dark ages. Romantic writers imagine Grail bloodlines, families whose legitimacy stems not from conquest, but from descent from a sacred union reaching back before church and crown. Most of this is story layered on story, but notice how it behaves. It challenges one monopoly on antiquity by inventing another. We've moved from the king is heir of the god-kings to our hidden house is heir of the god-kings. The mechanism is unchanged. Freemasonry steps into this theatre with a more architectural myth, not so much blood, but blueprint. Lodges stage dramas about the building of Solomon's temple, the murder of an architect to protect sacred measures, the quest to recover lost words. For many members it's moral allegory, nothing more. But the symbolism plugs straight into the old current. Geometry, orientation, sacred number, all echoing those archaic obsessions with aligning human order to a cosmic pattern first established out there and back then. Whether consciously or not, the craft offers initiates a taste of participation in that lineage, a sense that one is no longer just a citizen, but a caretaker of an older schematic. In the Renaissance and early modern period, scholars and magi start talking about Prisca Theologia, a first theology behind all religions. Hermetic texts, Chaldean oracles, Orphic fragments are treated as shards of this wisdom. Again, some of this is fantasy, projections onto late compositions, but the desire is real to bypass corrupt institutions and drink from the same source the first lawgivers drank from. Here, the king list pattern mutates into a more philosophical key. Instead of justifying one monarchy, it justifies a certain elite of readers and experimenters as rightful heirs to an ancient, nearly lost conversation between heaven and earth. The 19th and 20th centuries pour gasoline on all of this. Archaeology drags actual cuneiform shards into museums. Suddenly, the Sumerian king list is no longer rumor but artifact. At the same time, occult movements like theosophy spin vast cycles of root races, lost continents, Mahatmas guiding humanity across aeons. They borrow real Mesopotamian and Vedic terms, tangle them with new revelations, and present a storyboard in which current adepts are in contact with the same hierarchy that allegedly presided before any flood. The pattern acquires a cosmic scale, spiritual evolution managed across millions of years by unseen councils. Into that swirl, darker currents pour. Racial mysticism lifts the idea of bloodlines out of scripture and legend, turns it into poison. If there was an ancient mandate, they say, it flows through our people, not theirs. Nazi ideology gorges itself on bastardized myths of Aryan origins and Hyperborean ancestors, casting conquest as reclamation. You can draw a jagged line from kingship descended from heaven to we alone carry the right to rule, propaganda. Same underlying addiction, a need to anchor violence and hierarchy in a story older than guilt. Parallel to that, popular writers like von Däniken and, more elaborately, Sitchin come along and point directly at the Sumerian tablets. They argue that the gods of the king list and the myths were flesh and blood extraterrestrials. The 241,200 years become a management period by off-world engineers. The descent of kingship is colonial administration. Mainstream scholars push back. The texts don't say what the paperbacks claim. But in the public mind, a new version of the old pattern catches fire. History as an occupation, elites as proxies of an alien board. The psychological move is old Sumer with rocket exhaust. The internet stitches this all together into a single paranoid quilt. References to antediluvian rulers, Nephilim, Anunnaki, fallen angels, secret orders, royal houses, corporate boards, global forums, they converge into the conviction that there is a continuous, conscious, tightly held line of control from the first god-kings to today's billionaire in a hoodie. Almost none of the specifics survive serious scrutiny, but the magnetism of the concept is enormous because it offers something ordinary life with its chaos rarely gives, a feeling that someone has always been driving, even if they're monsters. At the same time, a quieter but just as powerful myth arises around technology itself. Code, AI, predictive models are treated by many as quasi-oracles, opaque, neutral, above petty human bias. Decisions that once required a priest reading omens now come from dashboards. The story sold is that these systems are too complex for laypeople to question, born from an elevated priesthood of engineers who speak machine. Strip the chrome off and you're back with scribes and king lists. Trust us, we maintain the interface with forces you can't grasp. Here's where the Sumerian king list becomes unexpectedly useful. Not as proof of any particular conspiracy, but as an X-ray of how we swallow narratives of control. When you see in hard ancient text how casually a culture anchored its rulers in a 1,200-year prehistory, you gain perspective on any modern institution insisting it speaks for the arc of history or eternal values or what the data demands. You start asking, is this authority inviting me into understanding, or hiding behind an origin story I'm not allowed to touch. The list also whispers another often ignored truth. Every attempt to monopolize beginnings leaks. Scribes reveal their anxieties through variant copies. Mythmakers let sympathetic rebels like Enki slip in. Prophets and poets mock unjust kings in the name of higher laws. Even in the most rigid systems, something keeps insisting that legitimacy requires transparency, not just antiquity. That insistence grows louder the more literacy and access spread. You watching this, analyzing tablets with me from your room, are that insistence in action? So where does that leave you in the maze of claims? Ancient aliens, hidden dynasties, secret charters, divine rights, data priesthoods. It leaves you with work, but also with leverage. You don't have to choose between everything is controlled by one immortal cabal and there is no pattern at all. You can recognize recurring strategies, appealing to an unreachable start, hoarding technical knowledge, dressing politics in sacred time. You can study them without being ruled by them. You can demand that anyone invoking deep origins shows their receipts. And this, honestly, is why I love that you're still here with me. Because long-form, no-fluff conversations like this are how we take tools back. We read the old stones and modern speeches with the same calm suspicion, not to dunk on the past, but to understand the playbook. You're not just passively absorbing a spooky story about god-kings. You're training the part of your mind that notices when someone, ancient or modern, tries to hide power behind the phrase "since the beginning." Every time you comment, "I'm in São Paulo at midnight," or "I'm a trucker in Canada listening on the road," or "I'm 17 and no one around me wants to talk about this," I see the shape of something the king list never anticipated. A distributed memory. People across the planet without temples or thrones, comparing notes on how narratives of origin and destiny are built. That terrifies anyone who needs a monopoly on the story. It reassures me that the old tricks may finally be running out of runway. We're not done. There are still a few more knots to untie. How countdown cults reuse ancient math. How some modern elites consciously play with Anunnaki and pre-flood imagery as an in-joke or a brand. How real cycles, climate, catastrophe, resource strain hide behind melodramatic fantasies of chosen survivors. But I won't dump all of that on you in one breath. There's one more piece we need to face together before we close this, and it's the one that reaches straight from those damp, ancient tablets into the glow of your screen tonight. The way people keep turning that 200 for 200-year claim, that pre-flood kingship, into a countdown engine. Whenever a story convinces you that someone knew the beginning with impossible precision, it tempts you to believe someone also knows the end. That's how you get number-obsessed sects, Armageddon calculators, doomsday live streams, modern heirs of the same mindset that once carved antediluvian reigns into clay and said, "Trust us, we have the ledger." You see it in the way apocalyptic movements cling to dates like life buoys, a blood moon, a calendar turnover, an alignment in the sky. Suddenly the forums fill with graphs and verses and insider leaks that feel suspiciously like updated king lists. Many of them quietly recycle Mesopotamian structures, even if they never name them. World ages, floods, fire, chosen survivors. The mechanism is seductive. If time is scripted, then there's comfort in surrender. You don't have to act, you only have to interpret. Just wait for the promised crash, while the designated custodians of the real timeline tell you where we are on the clock. Then there are the 2012 waves, Nibiru panics, planetary catastrophe videos, pulling screenshots of Sumerian tablets and yelling, "Look, they warned us." The Sumerian king list gets spliced into end-of-the-world thumbnails, its cold numbers treated like a prophecy key instead of what it actually is. A record of how an early civilization legitimized its power by tying itself to a god age. People frightened by politics, climate, loneliness, Look at those wedges of cuneiform and think. At least, if an ancient script says it ends this way, the chaos has a narrator. Even terror feels better than meaninglessness when it arrives with a logo. Up the chain, some of the powerful play with this imagery, like it's just edgy wallpaper. Obelisks in plazas, all-seeing eyes in branding, Anunnaki jokes in music videos, luxury brands quietly echoing ziggurat silhouettes, tech conferences staged like cultic liturgies of the future. Most of it is aesthetic theft, but the symbolism still works on a gut level. It whispers, "We know the old language of power. We stand in that stream. We are clever enough to joke about god-kings because we sit where they sat." Even if it's a marketing team and not a priesthood, the message rhymes with the oldest clay. And sometimes it's not a joke at all. You get think pieces musing about philosopher kings of data, benevolent technocrats, guided democracy, stewards of planetary transition. None of that cites Alulim or Ziusudra, but it doesn't have to. It's the same fantasy, a special class armed with special knowledge managing the rest of us through crisis after crisis. When they frame their authority as the only rational response to models and risks you'll never fully see, they're building a secular version of kingship descending from a heaven of code and metrics, not stars. Meanwhile, the real cycles tick on, climate systems wobbling under our weight, ice cores whispering about sudden past shifts, craters and black mats telling stories of impacts we barely survived. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Buried under the Sumerian myths are genuine reasons for ancient people to think in terms of world ages, floods, resets. You don't need a literal 201,200-year line of alien CEOs for the planet to be dangerous. Geology and astronomy handle that just fine. The insult is that instead of sharing that knowledge as a commons, priesthoods old and new keep trying to turn it into a throne. That's why I'm bringing all of this to you in long form, without jump scare edits or clickbait shortcuts. Because you are absolutely capable of holding both ideas at once. That ancient texts encode fragments of real environmental and celestial memory, and that those same texts were, and are, used to train people to look up in awe instead of around in awareness. Once you see that double exposure, the magic trick loses half its force. You can respect the warning without bowing to the storyteller. So let's put our cards on the table. What have we really seen in the lost Sumerian king list that claims gods ruled Earth for 241 to 200 years? We've seen a psychology, authority anchored in a superhuman past. We've seen a structure, divine reigns, flood firewall, second ascent of kingship into human hands. We've seen a toolkit, sacred numbers as both calendar and crown. And we've seen a behavior. Every new power center racing to weld itself onto that deep time spine so it can say, "I am not temporary. I am the continuation." From Eridu to Kish, from tablets to constitutions, it is the same reflex. Where does that leave you, sitting here with earbuds in or a tab open in the dark? It leaves you with a choice sharper than any myth wants you to notice. You can let these stories of impossible antiquity and cosmic mandate convince you that your role is spectator, awed, suspicious, endlessly decoding clues from higher sources. Or you can raid the archive. Take the pattern recognition, the long memory, the humility before real cycles, and use them without accepting the attached chains. The tablets are not sacred in themselves. They are evidence of how people before you thought about power, fear, time, and responsibility. The fact you're still here, still listening, tells me which way you're leaning. You are not grazing through shorts. You're committing to a full investigation. That makes you dangerous in the best way, because you're harder to handle with cheap origin stories. When someone now tells you, "This is how it has always been. This is ordained by history, by destiny, by the hidden masters," some part of your mind will remember a four-sided prism from Nippur that said almost exactly that 4,000 years ago. and you'll ask the next question instead of kneeling. This channel, this little space we're building, is my way of refusing to leave that questioning to dusty specialists or noisy grifters. I'm here to sit with you in the long night and drag these source texts back into the open, to trace where they've been weaponized, where they might still be whispering genuine warnings, and where they're just being used as costume jewelry by brands and governments that hope you never read past the headlines. No secret handshakes, no hidden paywalled gnosis, just you, me, and the record. If this journey through the lost Sumerian king list has shifted how you see those conspiracies about bloodlines, Anunnaki, ancient elites, and eternal mandates, tell me. Scroll down and write where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I want you to feel how wide this circle really is. A nurse on break at 4:12 a.m. in Manila, a mason on lunch in Manchester, a student in Nairobi avoiding sleep, a guy in Texas driving nights with this playing through the speakers. When you speak up, you're not feeding an algorithm. You're letting the rest of us know we're not isolated dots. If you want this kind of work to keep cutting through the noise, slow, sourced, story-driven, refusing to talk down to you, then you already know the levers. Subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into the archives. Tap the like button if this helped you think in a new way. It's a small act that tells the machine, show this to more people who are tired of hollow mystery bait. Share it with one friend who you know is ready for something heavier than recycled alien memes and lazy debunks. And don't just listen. Use the comments as a workshop. Tell me which part of the 201,200-year narrative fascinates you or unsettles you. Is it the arithmetic of the rains, the flood firewall, the idea of encoded astronomy, or the way the same skeleton reappears in texts and movements that shape our world right now? Suggest the next tablet, the next anomaly, the next civilization you want us to interrogate together, whether it's the Apkallu sages, the Watchers, Gobekli Tepe's engineers, or the supposed off-world patrons everyone keeps invoking. Because here's the real punchline. The old stories never meant to give you, if anyone ever did sit on a throne for ages, if any council ever tried to run this planet like a long experiment, they failed. We're here, we're reading their records, we're questioning their methods. Their best attempt at unbreakable continuity is now a museum piece you can zoom in on from your phone. That means no throne is beyond audit, no mandate is beyond review, no since the beginning is above, show me how you know. The lost Sumerian king list is not just a window into a forgotten theology of divine kings. It's a mirror held up to every institution that still borrows its posture. And you right now are doing the one thing those ancient authors didn't design for, reading it without being under anyone's sword. That's the quiet revolution tucked inside this whole conversation. Once you see how the spell is cast, it's a lot harder for anyone, priest, president, platform, or phantom Anunnaki overlord, to cast it on you again. When you strip away the reverent silence of the museum and imagine the king list where it was meant to live, in a royal court thick with incense, recited in a voice trained to hypnotize, you begin to see its final move clearly. It doesn't end in the flood. It doesn't end in the God Kings. It ends with you being told that everything since that impossible 241,200-year overture is simply the continuation of a single sacred office. The story closes its circle. Past, deluge, throne, no gaps, no loose wires. History is a closed loop, and your place in it is to accept that the loop was forged by beings greater than you. That is the spell this text exists to cast. But if we walk back through its lines with clear eyes, we see all the places the spell frays. Those antediluvian reigns are not a gentle golden age, they are a statement of monopoly. A handful of names, each welded to tens of thousands of years, sit like monoliths before any memory of ordinary people. Then a single abrupt sentence, then the flood swept over, wipes the slate. No explanation, no remorse. The survivors, like Ziusudra, are not liberated. They are relocated, translated into near-divine status, removed from human reach. Whatever knowledge they carry is exiled with them. The possibility that those gods were custodians, engineers, or an earlier high civilization only sharpens the point. If they existed, their project culminated not in enlightenment, but in a bottleneck controlled by one chosen insider. On the other side of the water, the pattern restarts. Kingship descended from heaven. Not rose from people, not was earned, but descended, the same verb used before the flood, now stapling human kings to a vanished era. The last move of the old order is to ensure that whatever comes after still speaks in its name. Even when the lifespans shrink from 28,800 to 800 to 80, the architecture of power remains vertical. Your king, your law, your city are narrated as the rightful heirs of beings who were either not human or so inflated by memory that they might as well be. And yet, buried in that arrogance is their mistake. The very act of writing the king list fixes the myth in a form that can be handled, compared, questioned. Copies diverge. Some versions alter the totals, move cities around, omit or insert names. These fractures are tiny rebellions in clay. They show us that even then, different centers of power fought over who could claim the godline. Continuity was not a fact, it was a prize. The king list not only preserves the royal myth, it accidentally preserves evidence that the myth was contested. Follow that tension forward, and you start to see the outline of something older than any single regime, the human struggle over who owns the story of the beginning. Mesopotamian priests resolve it one way. The gods ruled first, chose kings after. Later traditions remix the cast, but borrow the structure. Ages of gods, a cataclysm, chosen. Survivors, sanctified thrones. Somewhere behind the changing names, a smaller, colder sentence pulses. If I can make you accept that your world began under someone else's hand, I can make you doubt your right to change it. Now bring in the other possibility, the one that draws so many of you here at 1:43 in the morning. What if those antediluvian entries aren't just symbolic? What if they're distorted echoes of a real order? Anunnaki administrators, hybrid dynasts, or a pre-Ice Age civilization with a grasp of astronomy and engineering we've only begun to rediscover? Even then, the lesson is not what the lazy versions tell you. Even then, the tablets say their system ended in disaster so complete it had to be rebooted through a single household. That is not an ad for perfect overlords, that is an indictment. If off-world or pre-flood custodians sat in judgment over humanity for 200 years, and the end result was a world scrubbed to the bone, their authority is not a comfort, it's a warning label. If the gods were just ancient elites deified over time, the warning is sharper. Human beings have been using stories of cosmic endorsement to justify control since the first cities dried clay in the sun. In both readings, kneeling to a modern copy of that posture, a politician, a priest, a CEO, an influencer claiming access to original truth, is to ignore the failure case written directly into our oldest records. What changes everything, and what the authors of that list could never have anticipated, is this. Their text outlived their palaces. Their gods' names chipped, their walls fell, but the prism endured under ash and sand long enough to land under neutral light, behind glass, in front of eyes that owe allegiance to no Sumerian king. You, me. Anyone willing to lean in and actually read. The same document that once underwrote absolute authority now stands exposed as an artifact we can pass, challenge, and set beside geology, astronomy, myth, and politics like any other data point. Seen from here, The so-called unbroken chain is full of breaks. Every city that claimed to receive kingship had to justify why it, not the last, now wore the crown. Every empire that pointed backward to divine founders eventually fell, leaving its successor to recycle the rhetoric. Even if there was once a genuine descent of something, knowledge, teachers, survivors, it has been handled by too many mortal hands to be unquestionable now. The spell decays with each retelling until it becomes what you've just watched it become, transparent. And yet, the psychic residue of that old architecture still clings to us. It's there whenever someone insists you must accept an order because it is ancient, a doctrine because it was revealed, a hierarchy because it is written. It's there in the way modern conspiracies flip between worshipping and hating imagined hidden elites, but almost never question the underlying assumption that somebody out there has always owned the script. That is the deepest inheritance of the king list, not proof of literal god kings, but the deeply ingrained belief that legitimacy must fall from above. The real ending to this story, the one they didn't and couldn't write into the clay, is quieter and stranger. It is a species that gains, piece by piece, the ability to read its own myths against the rocks and the stars, satellites tracing impact scars, and sea level changes that line up eerily with old flood stories. Archaeologists mapping cities that rose and fell outside the official lists, linguists, coders, and late-night obsessives pulling cuneiform, scripture, and rumor into the same frame, not to scoff, not to submit, but to understand. The monopoly on the beginning is gone. Somewhere between those tablets and your screen, kingship stops descending and starts dissolving. Authority grounded only in "we came first" or "they chose us" looks flimsy beside the simple, dangerous idea that knowledge is allowed to be shared horizontally. If there was ever a council of watchers, a line of god-kings, a hidden continuity, its descendant now is not a throne. It's a network of people who refuse to be pacified by either official slogans or cartoon conspiracy. People exactly like you, sitting in idling cars and tiny apartments, refusing to treat the past as either unquestionable scripture or throwaway content. From this angle, the 241,000 to 200-year claim becomes less a command and more a mirror. It reflects our obsession with anchoring meaning in a remote, uncontestable past. It shows us how far we'll stretch numbers to feel held, but it also forces a bolder question. If no story is beyond examination, if even the oldest political theological document on earth can be laid on the table and turned over, who or what gets to tell us what we are now? The god-kings are gone. The flood hasn't come to erase our responsibility. The list is just clay. So here, in this last turn, is the only ending that makes sense to me, and the only one I'm willing to share with you. The true legacy of the Sumerian king list is not an eternal mandate for hidden masters. It is a fossil of how early power tried to script reality and failed to keep a monopoly on the script. The gods ruled, or were imagined to rule, for 200 years. They are dust, their cities are ruins, their tablets sit under museum LEDs. And you, with cheap headphones or a cracked screen, are reading what was never meant for you. In that reversal lies the quiet, subversive hope this whole story has been circling, that whatever watched over the first cities, whatever survived the floods, whatever carved numbers into clay to make thrones look immortal, underestimated the one force that really does deserve to inherit the earth: conscious, stubborn, unintimidated human curiosity. The experiment, divine, alien, royal, or purely human, produced in the very long run a creature that can look its oldest gods in the eye, thank them for the data, and refuse the chains. And that is where we leave the god-kings, not as masters of your fate, but as case studies, not as the final word, but as the prologue to a story they never wanted told this way. A story in which the last line doesn't belong to a throne, or a tablet, or a name wrapped in sacred numbers, but to you, fully aware, fully awake, and finally willing to ask who benefits when someone says, "It has always been so," and who might be afraid now that you know it hasn't.